Well, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sharon Fitzpatrick, and I'm your co-host for today's webinar, The Orderly Conversation, Business Presentations Redefined with Greg Owen-Boger. Joining me as co-host is Dave Zielinski, the editor of PresentationXpert. To submit a question, as you know, just put it in the question pod on the dashboard. We talked about handouts, and we will make sure that the handout is also posted online with the recording. Let me tell you a little bit about what we do. We love to talk about presentations. We have a very active community. We also do host these webinars once or twice a month, and then we post them on air and on YouTube, and they're great to be able to go back and listen to what you have to say. At this point, what I'd like to do next is introduce Dave Zielinski, who is our editor, and he is just fabulous. He really knows his stuff. He is an award-winning writer. His book, Master Presenter, Lessons from the World's Top Experts on Becoming a More Influential Speaker, can be ordered on Amazon and through the link on our website. And Greg is definitely one of the people that contributes to the book. So, Dave, it's up to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Greg Owen-Boger. Greg is a vice president with Turpin Communication, a presentation and facilitation training company in Chicago, where he started as a cameraman in 1995. Greg facilitates Turpin's live workshops, provides private coaching, and is an instructor in the company's online courses. He offers clients a deep understanding of how to engage listeners, how to settle their racing minds, think on their feet, and initiate a genuine conversation. Greg also is the 2015 president of the Chicagoland chapter of the Association for Talent Development, formerly ASTD, and co-author of the compelling new book, The Orderly Conversation, Business Presentations Redefined, concepts of which he'll explore in today's webinar, which I'm very excited to listen to. With that, Greg, I'll hand it over to you, and good luck.
Super. Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate that introduction. And I have to say that as you were saying that I started my career with Turpin Communication back in 1995, it occurred to me that I'm actually celebrating 20 years of doing the same thing. That thought had occurred to me a few months ago, but I had forgotten about it because I've been so busy, and it just sort of came back to me today. So, one of the things that strikes me as I think about the last 20 years is that when you focus on something so narrowly in the way that we do at Turpin Communication, you really become something of a savant, quite the expert in this very narrow space. And that's really what the Orderly Conversation is all about. It's the culmination of all of these years of experience working with business presenters across all types of business units. And I am so pleased to be sharing all of these concepts with all of you today, and thank you, Dave and Sharon, for asking me. So let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I'd like to start by saying that we have a baseline understanding here in our office, and that is this: business presentations need to move business forward efficiently and effectively. And yet, so often, if you think back to many meetings, presentations, even training sessions that you've attended over the years, I'm guessing that you would say that many of them weren't very efficient and weren't very effective. So I would like to start today's webinar off by just asking the audience members. I see we have quite a group on the line right now. And Sharon was saying that many of you are in sales and training and all different types of industries. So I'm going to ask you to think about the last meeting or presentation that you attended. Was the speaker, now I'm not asking if you were effective or efficient, I'm asking if that other speaker was both efficient and effective. If you say yes, give us option number 1. If you say no, option number 2. I'll give you just a few moments to finish that poll, and Sharon, I will rely on you to let me know when most people have completed the poll.
We've got about 60% of the people that voted, and I was going to say we had a clear winner, but now we seem to be in a horse race to the finish. So let's give it about another 25 seconds, and I'll close the poll and share the results. What do you think? Do you think it's yes or no?
Well, given the amount of conversations I've had with business leaders across all different sorts of industries, no is the resounding answer. Now, I think that the people that are on this webinar are probably a little more sophisticated in their communication skills and in their organizations, perhaps. So it might be interesting to see what the result of this poll is.
Well, let me share the results. It is almost a horse race. 49% said yes and 51% said no.
51%. Okay, well, at least there's a majority there.
A small majority.
What's that?
It's a small majority, but...
It's a small majority, but still, if you think about how many people are on today's webinar, and over 50% of you are saying that the last presentation or meeting that you attended was not efficient and effective, I'd like to ask you to think about the result of what that is. How much time, how much energy, money, and goodwill are squandered every single day across this country and the rest of the world. And that becomes quite a dangerous number, I would think. And what I think is that we deserve something better. Now, one of the things that is causing these meetings and these presentations, these training sessions to be ineffective and inefficient is a very baseline thing, and it's that my colleagues and I have discovered that there needs to be a very strong distinction drawn between speeches and presentations. So if you take a look at this slide here, and by the way, the graphic in the upper right-hand corner of the slide says number 2. That's just telling you that this information, if you do have the handout, is on page number 2. So if we look at the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that this gentleman here is delivering a speech. You can tell he's in a fairly large room. He has a lectern. He has a script in front of him. It looks like a teleprompter of some sort over to his right. You can tell that he is very well rehearsed and delivering a one-way communication. Now, on the other side of the screen, on the right-hand side, we have a presentation. This is much less formal. People are seated. You can tell that they're even having a conversation across the table. Now, what's on the right-hand side labeled presentation is what we actually do day to day in the everyday business world. But unfortunately, we have been taught to deliver speeches. And so if you think about the outcome of that is that we've actually been using the wrong set of tools to create and deliver business presentations. And as my slide says here, that while speeches may inspire, which is a great thing, they create a distance between speaker and audience. So if a business presenter is using that type of communication thinking, they aren't really doing their job as well as they could. Where on the other hand, presentations bring speaker and audience together to get business done on that particular day. It's a very different set of skills, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue here. Now, over the years, we always debrief after each of our workshops, and this quote here came from one of us. I really can't remember who it was, but one of us said something to the effect of, we should just stop calling these things presentations altogether. Everyone gets hung up on that word. Wouldn't it just be easier to call them conversations, because that's what they really are? And after we started noodling on this concept, we realized that the concept of the orderly conversation started to come into focus, and that we needed to redefine business presentations. So before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit more about the work that we do at Turpin Communication. We help our clients and their employees move business forward. So what that means is we are not helping them with those big speeches. We're not talking about TED Talks. We're not talking about town hall meetings with the CEO. These are your everyday roll up your sleeves, get business done presentations, because that's what people do. This means that these everyday business presentations are practical, they're results driven, they tend to be very informal, often seated, often not even using PowerPoint, maybe just a spreadsheet or an agenda. And quite frankly, this content wouldn't mean much to people sitting outside of the organization or even the business unit in which this presentation is taking place. So that's the type of work that we focus on. Now, if we go back to this question of redefining presentations, what exactly would that mean? Well, it would mean that we're all going to have to unlearn a certain amount of things that we've learned in school or from other training or from bosses or peers or colleagues. And we'd also have to rethink a whole lot of things. So here is my agenda for the rest of this presentation. We're going to talk about ways to define success in a brand new way. We're going to talk about how to prepare for them. Then we need to know how to initiate and manage them, because if we can agree that it should feel like a presentation, they can get a little bit messy because by their very nature there are other people piling on and chiming in and offering pushback and asking questions, which means we need to understand how to deal with that. We also need to understand that we have a particular response to the process which needs to be managed. And finally, we need to understand the role that visual aids play. And there might be some rules that we're going to break as we move forward here as well. So this is my agenda for the next 45, 50 minutes or so. And I wanted to pull up a big question mark here on the agenda because I want you to be able to ask questions, and Sharon will be monitoring the questions for me as we move forward. So feel free to type those into the chat feature, and she will collect those questions and either interrupt me or when I ask for questions, she can ask those. And as Sharon was saying when we first started, the handout is available in the pod to your right on the interface. But if that isn't working for you, you can also go to theorderlyconversation.com/share. And I believe that is in the chat feature. I can't actually see that myself, but I think it's been put there. You are more than welcome to use the handout in any way you see fit. Okay, let's have another poll. Sharon started to ask this question as you were all coming into the webinar, but I'm curious. I want to make sure that I can focus the conversation on you. So who are you? Are you an individual contributor, a manager, or a senior leader? And if you don't quite fit into one of those buckets, just choose one of them. And Sharon, I will leave it up to you to tell me when that is.
We've got about half the people have voted, and right now the lead is individual contributors. So let's just kind of see where we go. I'll give it about another 25 seconds, then I'll close the poll and share the results.
Super, thanks.
Let me share the results with you, and you will see that definitely 47% said individual contributor, 35% manager, 18% senior leader. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you so much. So it looks like we have a fairly good mix here with the individual contributor being the most on the conversation. And I will try to make sure that I focus today's conversation so that I can meet the needs of all three types. Let's do a little exercise here in the chat. I want to get to know you just a little bit more. What is your role at your organization? Are marketing, training, sales? Let's just get a nice picture of where the bulk of you are. And again, Sharon, I'll rely on you to let me know when people have answered.
Great. Just want to remind everybody, you just have to put that answer in the question pod or the chat and tell us a little bit about you, and we will be glad to find out what the audience looks like. So we have, gosh, I think it's across the board, but we definitely see, I'd say a pretty much training, management, sales, and marketing. It's pretty split all the way across. We have a couple of IT, a lot of marketing, training management. We have one person in finance, HR, and that's pretty much consistent across the whole thing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks. All right. So let me ask you this then. As a workplace professional, whether you're in sales, marketing, training, HR, IT, whatever you're in, how do you want to be perceived by others? Go ahead and chat your answer. Most people say articulate, knowledgeable, the expert. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
We have competent, resourceful, influential, knowledgeable, innovative, consistent, genuine, professional, effective, interesting, problem solver, subject matter expert, creative, approachable. We have, it's pretty much consistent. I'm seeing the same things. And then last but not least, leader. Back to you.
Okay, so I heard all sorts of things there. One of the words that I truly love is genuine. And I think it's really important that we do make sure that our communications are genuine. Here's the thing, though. I mean, I agree with everything that all of you chatted in there. And unfortunately, what we see working with people who hire us to improve communications is that business presenters often are disengaged, disorganized, long-winded. They have unclear goals. Now, of course, people aren't all of these things all of the time, but when we come into sort of a triage situation, these are the things that we're seeing. The presenters are distracted, they're nervous, bulldozing, they lose track of time. And if you build this up over time, meeting after meeting after meeting, what happens within an organization then is a loss of trust in communication and also a loss of goodwill. So let's just name some guy named Stephen. Stephen is a project manager, and he has a lot of people working with him on any given project. But his meetings are free-for-alls. They're crazy. He's not organized. They go all over the place, and people leave more confused than they actually were when they came in. And so over time, nobody wants to ever work with Stephen again. And so he's lost their trust and their goodwill. Then fast forward to the next job that Stephen wants. Is he going to be at the top of the list? No, he's not. So this is the reason that it is so important to understand that we need to redefine presentations and meetings and all the skills that go with it so that we can make sure that we can meet our goals of being genuine, a leader, articulate, knowledgeable, the subject matter experts, all of those things that you all chatted just a minute ago. So as I said a little bit ago, we deserve something better, and the people that we work for also deserve something better. So here's our first guiding principle, that presentations are orderly conversations. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have that circle, which is orderly, which the data is organized. It needs to be accurate and structured. This is the preparation of the PowerPoint deck, the Keynote deck, whatever your slideware is, or even just an Excel spreadsheet or an agenda. So this is the orderly side, the planning side of putting together a presentation or a meeting. On the other side, we have conversation, which means it needs to be spontaneous, it needs to feel interactive, it might be nonlinear, and sometimes that's absolutely fine, and it requires a deep level of engagement. Now, if we take a look at this and start to unpack it, you realize that this is why one of the reasons why communication can be so difficult, because the planning side, the orderly side, takes place in the past in a certain channel of your brain, and the conversation takes place now, in this moment right here, in another channel of your brain. And the two extremes here, the orderly and the conversation, don't play very well together. And of course, this is an oxymoron and exactly why we like this concept of the orderly conversation. And if you think about it, these concepts can be applied to all sorts of communication events: presentations, training sessions, facilitated discussions, meetings, conference calls, any outcome-oriented communication event that's prepared, well organized, and takes place in a responsive conversational way. So what this means then on the orderly side, that as we are putting together our documentation, we need to make sure that we're not just creating a static document, but we're creating a document that helps us look ahead to the uncertainties of the conversation and build in some flexibility. And then once the conversation starts, we need to be able to adapt what was planned to what's happening in the moment right now. Now, for some of us, this is not a difficult task at all. For others of us, it's a really a big challenge. And so let's unpack this just a little bit more. Okay, here is another guiding principle of our work, and that is this, that business presentations move business forward and succeed on two separate levels. So on level one, this is really easy to get your arms around. Level one is just that you achieve the goal. You're clear, you're concise and persuasive so that your audience members buy, agree, align, or learn. That's a really easy one to get your arms around. Level two, though, is a little more elusive. The level two of success is, are you managing the process? In other words, you need to create the conditions for a fruitful conversation and establish context, earn their trust and goodwill. Remember Stephen, who wasn't doing that. You need to make it easy and manage the give and take of the process. So often what we see is that, and 51% of you probably would agree with this too, that oftentimes achieving the goal, that is level one, is not met because the process itself was not managed very well by the speaker. So I'm wondering at this point if there are any questions that have come in, Sharon?
There definitely is. Thank you to getting the questions from our audience. You just talked about creating the conditions for a fruitful conversation. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, yeah. Something happened just a few weeks ago when I was with a client. She's not a trainer, but this particular role that she has, she had to onboard people at a pretty consistent rate. Like I think it was about once a month. And these onboarding programs that she did, she was just one piece of this larger puzzle. But she had to deliver 3 separate phases. And she said, well, it's really not 3, it's actually 2, because the first one, nobody really understands the first time around, so I have to deliver it a second time, the second week, and then on the third week we can get into more, a deeper dive. And right there, if she was delivering the identical content in week 1 and week 2 because she wasn't able to make sense of all this information to her audience members, these new employees, on week 1. So she, by no fault of her own, she just didn't have the skills or the knowledge or the expertise in order to do this, but she was not creating conditions for the fruitful conversation or fruitful learning to take place. So she was wasting those people's time, having to make them sit through this entire full day learning session again. So that's what I mean by creating the conditions for a fruitful conversation.
We have had a couple requests for you to just go back and review level 2 in your previous slide.
Sure. It's managing the process right here. So level 1, it's easy to get your arms around. That's achieving the goal. That's making sure that people in the end of the meeting or the end of the presentation or the learning event are ready to buy or agree or align or learn. The other level is managing the process. You as presenter creating the conditions for this fruitful conversation to take place. And that means making it easy, providing context, and really managing the process. In other words, not letting one particular person bulldoze the meeting too much, or if you notice that nobody is really talking and they're just enduring the meeting, knowing what to do to help them gain interest. Okay, so we've defined success in a new way. Now we need to figure out how to prepare for this type of communication event. So there are some preparation assumptions that are attached to the Public Speaking 101 or the speech-making model that we need to talk about first. First, there is a right way and a wrong way to do something, and we just simply do not believe this. We're pragmatists, we're realists. We understand that we're all wired very differently, so there isn't necessarily a right way or a wrong way to communicate. Another assumption is that design or slide design paves the way to success. There's a lot of discussion, has been for years, that pretty pictures on slides are better than lists of bullets. And while I would agree that pretty pictures are nice, if we rely exclusively on pictures, it doesn't necessarily help the presenter or the audience member understand the concepts. So we need to be careful of thinking that design paves the way to success on its own. We also need to put into check the assumption that perfection is possible and desired. I don't know about anybody else on the line, but when a presenter is so polished and so perfect, I get a little bit nervous, like this person is just a little too slick. It's like those infomercials. Don't really quite trust the people, although apparently they work because infomercials still exist. And then finally, the other assumption is that rehearsal is a must. So let's dig into this a little bit here. I want to introduce you to Jennifer. Jennifer is one of 8 characters in the book, The Orderly Conversation. And just to back up for a moment, in the book, there are 8 individuals who are attending a workshop on communication. And they are fictional characters, but yet very real based on the types of people that we've met over the years. So Jennifer suffers from extreme nervousness. I'm sure that you have come across many Jennifers over the years. So Jennifer really makes the assumption that rehearsal is an absolute must for her to get through just her monthly financial presentation to her team. So this is a low-stakes situation for Jennifer, but she's making it into something much more stress-inducing. So these are her assumptions. I will be nervous, so therefore I will rehearse, which will give me control of what I want to say, which will give me confidence, which will reduce my nervousness, so therefore my presentation will succeed. Now, it would be great if that's actually what happened in real life, but what actually happens looks something more like this. I'll be nervous, so I will rehearse, which will give me control of what I want to say, which will give me confidence, which will reduce my nervousness. But, oh no, I'm not saying things the way I planned, and that really flusters me, and now somebody has a question, and now I'm really nervous. And next time, well, I guess I just need to rehearse more. So you can see that this faulty way of thinking of that rehearsal is the way to go just repeats the cycle, and it shows that rehearsal can actually increase nervousness. Now, I'm not saying that you should never prepare yourself for a presentation. I think that you should, especially the higher the stakes, the greater that need is. But we need to be careful of assuming that rehearsal and practice actually makes perfect, because I don't believe that it does. So if we go back to these two levels of success, we can add something else here, is that perfection and performing have little to do with measuring the success of a presentation. The success is whether they walked out of the room ready to buy, agree, learn, align, and whether we've managed the process appropriately. So let's replace these faulty assumptions with some recommendations. We need to understand that we need to initiate and facilitate a process. It's not a product. We need to create the conditions for a fruitful conversation. That's a theme that we've had so far today. We also need to understand that we need to prepare to be flexible rather than preparing to be rigid or preparing an actual product. And finally, we need to understand that slides will be used in various ways. So let's give you the first tip here on how to frame the conversation to get it off on the right start. Or the right foot, excuse me. So here we have a picture of a frame. It has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Now, there's nothing terribly earth-shattering on this slide, because it sort of follows the tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them model. The problem, though, with that thinking is it's all tell. It's no listen. It's no think. So we need to figure out a way to frame a conversation to bring the listening and the thinking and the agreeing into the equation. We do that by understanding that there are two types of slides that we need to work with. One type of slide we're going to call framing slides. That's over here on the right-hand side. We're pointing to both the introduction and the conclusion. Then in the middle, we have the content slides. So those are two very different types of things. The framing slides help us meet the process goal. That was the second level of success, which means we're providing direction, purpose, context, and a reason for everybody to participate in the conversation. And then, of course, when the conversation is done, we need to summarize and set next steps. On the right-hand side, I just built this slide to show you the internal agendas that I've been using. Those are also considered framing slides because they let the audience know where we've been and where we still have to go. So I'm a big fan of those types of framing slides. Now, the content goal can be accomplished through the content slides, or in other words, the subject of the conversation. So why bother making the distinction? Well, the reason we want to bother is because your comfort zone as the presenter is right here in the body. This is where you are the subject matter expert or the sales expert or the learning expert. But your audience, this is their comfort zone in the conclusion and in the introduction. I'm sure you've all attended a presentation or a meeting or even a training session where the speaker didn't really set the stage, didn't frame things up appropriately, and you really weren't sure why you were there or why you had been asked to participate. It's because that presenter did not do their work of creating a frame for you. So here's a simple way to do this. We have 4 framing elements, and the image shows that they look like sticky notes. Now, one of the things people often say to us, oh, I love that sticky note concept. I want to be clear that we did not invent the sticky notes concept of going analog. Many other presentation experts have done that. But what we put on those sticky notes might be a little bit different than what you've heard in the past. So the first one up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have the audience's current situation. It's really good to name that situation when you go into that meeting. For example, you might want to say something like, or acknowledge that, well, sales are down, we need to fix that. Or customer service rates have been, dipping, we need to fix that. Maybe the current situation is good news. Maybe it's, hey, sales are up, but we have no idea why, so let's figure it out. Or the audience's current situation could actually be something as simple as, well, as we all know, here we are in our staff meeting, so let's get going. So what we want to do with the audience's current situation is bring everybody into the same moment by addressing what's going on. Moving over to the goal or the recommendation, this is just where we state why we're here today. Our goal is to slog through the staff meeting, or our goal is to gain alignment on this new process. Or maybe you're making a recommendation that option B of the 3 we talked about last week is the one we want to go with. Whatever it is, don't make your audience guess at what you're trying to accomplish. Now, this is the reverse of how we've been taught to write. We were taught to write, make your argument, make your argument, make your argument, make your argument, therefore I recommend this. With business spoken communication, that should be flipped. I'm recommending this, and here's why, and here's why, and here's why. It just makes the communication event easier for you to manage and easier for everybody else to participate in. And remember, that's part of that second level goal of success. Okay, moving down into the left-hand corner, we have the agenda. And the agenda is just simply a list of things that we're going to talk about today. Nothing special, just a list. And then, of course, in the lower right, we have the benefits to them. What do they gain from this? Well, they gain higher market share, or greater profit, or happier consumers, or less confusion on the manufacturing floor. So those are the 4 concepts here in the framing elements. Let me put this into practice for you, because remember, we want to make sure that we're providing direction, purpose, context, and a reason to participate in the conversation. So I want to introduce you now to Sophia. Sophia is a senior trainer at a credit union. She's also a character in the book. She is training these member service reps on a program called Member Service 2.0. And what Sophia is very concerned about is that her member service reps, what we used to call tellers, are quite resistant to the idea of Member Service 2.0. They feel like this is a terrible idea. So Sophia, for her, the stakes are high, and she's going into a room of frustrated people. So she might start this conversation off something like this. Hey, everyone, I want to make it really clear that I know that change like this can be very difficult. Many of you have been in this role for a long time, and the relationships that you have with our members are really quite strong. Our goal today with Member Service 2.0 is to learn how to identify some value-added opportunities for our members. Our agenda, we're going to talk about 4 things. First, why this initiative at all? Because I know you're kind of concerned about why we're bothering to do this. Then we'll talk about where you fit into the big picture. Third, we'll talk about the products and services that we offer. And don't worry, this is just a review. There's nothing new here. But finally, and probably the most important piece of the day, is we're going to talk through some strategies for how to start these conversations with your friends, your members. Finally, what's in it for you? Well, we believe that this will strengthen your relationships with our members. So if we go back and think about Sophia and the high stakes and very difficult situation that she was in, given what I just did there as I was role-playing Sophia, I think you would agree that Sophia offered direction, purpose, context, and a reason to participate in that training. Now, this is not going to work all the time, and you have to be able to stretch it and fix it, because it's very flexible to make it your own. But this is a really good way to get your conversation started on the right foot. Now, we also need to be able to design materials with delivery in mind. That means that how the visual aids will be used should trump design. Again, I'm all for pretty pictures, but if they don't trigger the right thoughts or they don't support the speaker, they're lousy visual aids. So going over the 3 boxes here means we need to create meaningful slide titles. I'm going to go into detail quite a bit there on that. But then we need to build in triggers and give the presenter a so what. So let me introduce you now to Luis. Luis is an entrepreneur. He's very young. He looks much younger than he actually is. He's speaking to venture capitalists, so the stakes are very high. He needs a lot of money. The problem or the challenge that Luis faces is that he's disorganized in his thoughts. He's always in his head. He's forgetful. And he knows for a fact that because this is such a high-stakes presentation, he's going to be nervous. So I was coaching him in the book, and he shows me this slide. This slide here, it shows gross sales over several months. But if Luis is disorganized and otherwise distracted and nervous, gross sales and this slide really aren't going to do much to support him in this conversation. So my coaching for him would be to fix the slide title. So I'm going to advance this slide and pull your attention to the slide title. So there we just went from gross sales to month-over-month sales growth. Now, you can see now that that tees up a very specific conversation for Luis. So because Luis is distracted, he's in his head, he's nervous, all he needs to do is look to his slide title to trigger the right thoughts. Oh, he would say to himself, I want to talk about month-over-month sales growth. Again, that tees up a much different conversation than simple gross sales. But let's take this one step further. Let's say that the real story for Luis is right here, the bump in sales from April to May. He can just put a circle there to pull his attention to that particular place. Again, what we're doing here is we're building in a safety net for Luis because he can't trust himself once he gets into the conversation. So this is a way that he's making it not only easy for himself, but also easy for the venture capitalists to pull their attention in the right spot. Another thing we can do is create a so what box. Like we have here, positive trending equals positive forecasting into next year. Now, these concepts I just went through here in slide design are very basic, and yet what we see working with our clients across all industries, across all different levels in the organization, is that people aren't designing their slides in a way that's actually going to support them once the conversation starts. And if you go back to one of the graphics earlier, I said that as you are planning, you need to think ahead to the uncertainties of the conversation. This is the way, one of the ways that you can do that. You know that you're going to be uncertain, so therefore build in your own safety net. I'm wondering now if there are any questions here.
There definitely are, Greg. I mean, you showed us some slide design ideas for triggering your thoughts during the presentation. A lot of times we don't get to control the content. What about if you have to deliver someone else's slide and you can't change them? What do you do?
Yeah, that is a real challenge. So delivering slides that somebody else created, if you think about, go back to the concept of the orderly conversation, the assumption that we are making is that the presenter is also in charge of developing the content. But what do you do when you have to deliver somebody else's slides? Because the disconnect there is even greater than it is otherwise. Well, I would say that you need to look at every single slide or groupings of slide and really understand what is the story here. And if you can, I'm not asking you to change content because obviously this person has said you may not change this, but if you can, build in a trigger, put a circle someplace or an arrow that will pull your attention to the right spot. Now, you're not changing the content, you're just helping yourself once the conversation starts. And I would also say that if any of you, the people that are on this webinar today, are responsible for developing slides for somebody else to deliver, don't put them in that situation of saying you may not change these slides. Bring them into the conversation earlier so that they have ownership over the development of the content and then get their buy-in before you cut them loose. And then, of course, once you cut them loose, if at that point you say do not make any more changes, that's perfectly fine, but at least you've given the presenter some buy-in early on. Okay, super, thank you. All right, so here we are in our third agenda point. We need to know how to initiate and manage these conversations. So here we have a presenter, and he is engaged. You can see that he is actually making a true connection with the individuals that is in his audience. He's not nervous, he has an outward focus, he's here and now and seeing faces, and he's really connected. In other words, as the bottom of the slide says, he's able to think on his feet because he is engaged in the same way that he is in any other low-stakes, day-to-day conversation just sitting down at dinner. But what happens when the stakes are high and we get nervous, we become like this woman here where she is just all closed in and she has an internal focus. We worry about being perfect or worried about our performance, or we think about our voice or our hands. I'm sure everybody on the line can relate to at some point being in front of a group of people and then all of a sudden being very self-conscious and feeling like your hands are heavy and you don't know what to do with your body and how am I standing, and you're thinking about the wrong thing. So what we want to make sure that we do is we're constantly outwardly focused on our listeners. Now, here are some coaching techniques that I'm going to provide for you, that these will work for yourself and for other people if you get to coach them. So think about the concept here of the funhouse. This is that last moment in Greece where John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John are dancing and they are in the funhouse. But if you're actually in the funhouse, it's actually not very fun because the floors are doing that wobbly thing and the mirrors are making you look fat or skinny or sideways or twisted. And then, to make matters worse, you have to get through this spinning barrel at the end of the funhouse. But here's the deal, though. If you just look at the horizon and you make a beeline straight through this spinning barrel, you can get through it. And we use this image because it's very similar to dealing with being nervous or disengaged. You can get through it. You just need to take control of the skills that it takes to get through that spinning barrel. So here on my slide, there are two things. Pausing and breathing on the left-hand side. Pausing and breathing just settles your mind so that you can take control of your thoughts. On the other side, we have eye contact, which helps you make a connection with the listeners. Now, if we were in a full workshop, we would spend about half a day working on these two skills, because they're the two skills that when we become disorganized and disengaged and nervous, these are the first two skills that leave us. So we have to really take control and make sure that we are intentional about them. Now, I was leading a webinar several months ago, and it was the type where I could see the chat that was coming in. And I happened to know this particular person who was chatting. He's a competitor of ours, and he said, eye contact and pausing, is that all you got? Well, no, actually it's not. But everything that we do needs to be built on this concept of being in control, able to think on your feet and engaged. And the way we do that is through pausing and eye contact. And, of course, the point is to work from the inside out. This is not about the appearance of good delivery skills, but the effect that it has on you, the speaker. So we're not talking about dramatic pauses. We're not talking about staring people down. We're talking about just simply making a human connection. And what we see working with people all the time is that this is the root cause of a lot of their communication issues, because they simply aren't in control and they aren't engaged. So I'm wondering now if there are any questions there.
We definitely have a comment and a couple of questions. So Chris said, Chris wanted to share with us that when they're working on developing a deck, they definitely making them tell a story as a whole is really key. And they just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We have a question from Jim. A lot of engagement principles assume one is there in person. Any suggestions about meetings where people are connected via teleconference?
Well, like we're doing right now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, and I do speak a lot on webinar, and I do webinars on webinars, and it gets quite meta if you think about that. But the point is true. I think you said the questioner's name was Jim. When you can't make that connection with people, you lose 50% of your engagement skills. And so you have to really work that much harder. One of the things that I do to keep my energy level up, to make me feel like I'm more engaged with you right now, is I'm actually standing up and I'm walking around my office. And so rather than sitting at my desk, almost getting monotone and talking to people, I've got a little bit more energy going. And while that may not make me feel more engaged, I'm hoping that it helps the listeners feel more engaged.
Well, you know, Greg, that's a good point, because one of the things that's really hard is when you're not seeing faces. So one of the slides said that when you're engaged, you see faces. What do you mean?
Yeah, so when you are engaged, and let's assume that we are in a live meeting situation, you see faces and you respond to them. Now, we do that naturally in everyday conversation, and we need to be able to do that in business presentations as well. Working with people, though, one of the very first questions I ask them, you know, they will get up and they'll deliver a portion of their presentation, and then we'll talk about how that felt. One of the first questions is, do you remember seeing your audience members' faces? If their answer is yes, then it's clear to me that they're on the right path. But if they're honest and they say, no, actually I didn't see their faces, that tells me that they really weren't engaged and they really weren't clicked in. So the first step for that person, coaching that person, is to make sure that they really understand what it feels like and what it means to make that solid eye contact with people, so that you do see their faces, you see their response, you see that they're ready to move on, or that they're confused, or that they're with you. And that should build upon itself and give you the confidence you need to move forward confidently in your presentation.
We have one final question, then I'll turn it back to you, from Sherry, who says, I'm a very confident speaker. However, sometimes when I'm presenting to senior leaders, I find myself nervous. How still able to deliver? What can I do to overcome this nervousness after 10 years?
Yeah, so nervousness is triggered for different. people, it's triggered in different ways. For some people, it's the people that are in the room. And I would say that for me, that's probably, if nervousness isn't much of an issue for me anymore, but if nervousness kicks in, it is because of the level of people that are there. The same thing applies. As counterintuitive as it is to look these people in the eye, it's an absolute must, because they're human beings too. And so even though you don't want to look them in the eye, even though they are the ones making you nervous, if you work on that and make the eye contact intentional, over time that will help you reduce the nervousness.
So a stare down's not a good idea.
A stare down is not a good idea. And we're not talking like extended laser piercing eye contact. It's, you know, just enough to make that connection. It's a phrase, it's a thought.
Sounds perfect. Back to you.
Okay, super, thanks. So I realize that I'm running a little bit behind, and actually this next section will help explain why. But we need to manage our response to the process. So if we go back to this concept of the default approach, we can understand that we are all going to default, or we're going to gravitate to one side of the orderly conversation over the other. So let me unpack this for you just a bit. Those of you who are more comfortable on the orderly side, like the woman who's here on the left-hand side of the screen, we're going to call you a writer. Writers, the focus often goes to the plan. They feel there's often never enough time to prepare. They really need structure and predictability. And the good thing is that they're naturally thorough, careful, detailed, and accurate, and they thrive with organization and preparation. The downside is once the conversation starts, they can be inflexible and strict during delivery. So that is the extreme picture of a writer, someone who really gravitates toward the orderly side. On the other side, we have improvisers. This guy here, his focus is going to the plan, going to the people. He might delay preparation until the last minute. I know I do. I'm an improviser. Improvisers need to be spontaneous and engaged, and we're responsive and unafraid to make last-minute changes. In other words, we thrive with that connection with individuals, but we can lose focus and cause confusion during delivery. Now, I said I will explain to you why I'm running just a little bit late here. I'm an improviser, and often improvisers, one of our downsides, charming perhaps, but downside, is that a thought comes into our head and we're going to say it, and then another thought comes into our head and we're going to say it. The problem is that that sort of mosaic conversation can cause confusion and ultimately time constraints during presentations. So while it's good to be both, it's good to understand where you are on this continuum, either a writer or an improviser. It's also good to understand that there are strengths and weaknesses associated with both sides of this equation. Now, for those of you who have the handout, you will notice that there is a self-assessment in the handout. You are more than welcome to take that or share it with your colleagues after the webinar is over. So let's do a quick poll, Sharon, if we could. I'm curious, of everybody who's on the line here, are you more of a writer or an improviser?
We're just going to have encourage people to put it in chat, and we'll share it with everyone.
Okay, super.
I would say it's 50-50.
Yeah, that's pretty typical, actually. That's what we see.
We have a couple of people who feel they're a mix of both, a bit of both. So
yeah, and that is,
writer for others, improviser for themselves. So I'd say that's kind of the direction we're going in.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that, Sharon. Yeah, now this is not a black and white thing. For those of you that are like, oh, I'm not sure, I would encourage you to take that assessment. And the thing is that this is a fluid sort of thing. And it's just good to understand where is your head at when the idea of a presentation or a meeting or a training session comes into your mind, and then what's your default approach, or what do you normally do, and is that a good thing or is it a not so good thing? So here are some recommendations for you. Writers, learn to trust yourself. Your brain is a good one. It's a super brain, but you need to be able to trust yourself to actually communicate the information once the conversation starts. And please stop trying to be perfect. Nobody is expecting you to be perfect, particularly in a business setting. And also, as we've been talking about, prepare yourself to be flexible. Now, improvisers, recommendations for us, this is really important. We need to accept the audience's need for structure. we don't feel necessarily that that structure is that important because our brains aren't wired that way. But our audiences need that structure, so we just need to give into that and give them the structure that they require. And then use your slide titles to keep you on track. We talked about that earlier. It's really important for improvisers. And then feel free to improvise, but do it within the framework of that particular agenda point or that particular slide title. Another thing we need to think about is managing this orderly conversation. So here we have a picture of a guy on a teeter-totter. And I know some of you probably want to call this a seesaw, but I grew up in Northwest Ohio outside of Toledo, and it was definitely a teeter-totter where I grew up. So here he has this teeter-totter, and he's sitting there between two extremes. One is he needs to control the room and control the message, but he also needs to encourage participation among the individuals that are in the room. Now, this is an active process. He shouldn't just be sitting down on this. This is something that he needs to work really hard at. And the idea here is that we have skills and techniques that we can pull out of our bowl that's sitting in our lap and exert pressure onto one side or the other. In other words, telling people, hey, we're going to stick to the agenda, that's a way to control the conversation. It might have gone off in many directions because you encourage too much, but at some point you have to pull it back, take control, and you can do that by saying, you know what, we've only got 10 minutes left, we have another agenda point that we need to deal with. It's a very simple way to take control back. On the other hand, if he needs to encourage participation, he might need to be patient with people and give them some time to think about this concept that he is explaining. So again, this goes back to the importance of being engaged and being able to think on your feet, being able to read the audience and understand what is necessary at any given point. Now again, there's a lot more content in the handout about this encourage control technique. I encourage you to print that out and use it. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I believe my email address is in one of the slides a little bit later on. But if we go back to this idea of the second level of success, that is of managing the process, we also understand that we need to create the conditions for a fruitful interaction. So on the encourage side, that means we need to appear open, we need to listen, work to really understand what is it that they're saying, be careful of interrupting, and of course, respect their needs. On the control side, you want to make sure that you're keeping everyone in mind. And what I mean by that is, let's assume that someone has just run off with the presentation and they've gone off on some rant. Well, your job is, you are responsible for the entire room and everyone there. So by keeping everyone in mind, you can just say something like, that's an excellent point, Stephanie, that you bring up, but I need to bring us back because the content we're talking about today is X, not Z. So now what everybody else in the room is thinking, oh, thank goodness, he's brought everybody back. And another control technique is keeping them on track. Make sure that the conversation is relevant. Of course that you meet your goals. And as we've been saying, make it fruitful. This means, of course, that you need to remain engaged. You need to pause, give yourself time to think. All the while, you are monitoring their interest and their mood. And either leaning on the control side or the encourage side. I'm going to ask that we hold questions at this moment right here. I'm actually going to exercise a control technique because I want to make sure that I have enough time to get to my final agenda point. And Sharon, if there are any questions that came in from that section, you can hold those off for me for a little bit later, because we need to understand the role that visuals play. And I love this slide because it implies a little bit of hanky-panky, but the point of it is that I am not the PowerPoint police. I don't think that there should be any hard and fast rules that should be always applied in all situations, because we need to understand that business presenters and audiences use content slides in different ways. So here in the middle of my slide, you can see that I'm showing what would be considered a traditional visual aid. It's a very simple little image of that frame that we talked through earlier. It's designed to communicate something very quickly, and it passes the glance test. The glance test is just something where you look at something for an instant and know exactly what it is. You don't have to think about it too much. On the other hand, there are slides that sometimes you do have to think about. And this slide here, you can think of it more as notes or a reference for the presenter. That's perfectly fine. Now, I said earlier that I was going to debunk some myths or break some of the rules. This rule of only having so many slides, or I'm sorry, so many words per slide or so many bullets just isn't practical in the world of business, because sometimes it's the bulk of that information that's important, not that there are only 5 things on the slide. And then over here on the right-hand side, sometimes slides need to be documents. If you are looking at the handout, you know that that self-assessment that I mentioned earlier is a very wordy document, and it makes a lousy visual aid, but that's okay. Sometimes you want to throw that image up onto the screen and then give people a handout so that they can read it or study it. The same thing is true with spreadsheets. You know, I hear people say a lot, oh, I know the spreadsheet is really busy, but let's talk through it. That's perfectly fine if the spreadsheet is busy. Just make sure that you have a hard copy and you build in some triggers or some bold or highlighting areas where you want to pull the conversation or the story. Finally, this is my final point. We need to learn to direct people's focus appropriately. It's very much like show and tell. Here in the upper right, you can see that my presenter is pointing to this orange pie chart, or the orange slice in the pie chart. She's walked away from her listeners. She's actually turned her back. She's pointing. She's actually talking to the slide. That's okay, because in that moment, it's not about her. It's about the information that's on the slide. And then when she's done pointing to that, she can turn around, down in the lower left hand of my slide, walk toward the audience and say, you know, listen to me. This is how I want you to think about this. Now, this breaks some rules that you've all heard about turning your back to the audience, never look at your slide. For heaven's sake, don't ever read your slide. And we just don't think that that's very helpful, because what we need to do is bring the slides into the conversation. And here's the thing. It's just like the nightly weather report. We have been watching people do this for years on TV without question, and yet for some reason in business presentations we expect the speaker to not do that. So I say get rid of those rules and learn what the meteorologist has to say here. So to wrap things up from our webinar today, instead of rehearsing for perfection, you should prepare yourself to be flexible. Next, instead of following the rules of delivery, make sure that you engage people in a genuine conversation. Instead of following a one-size-fits-all approach, make sure you adapt to your default approach. And instead of keeping visuals in the background, bring them into the conversation so that you can get business done. And finally, instead of controlling group interactions, create the conditions for a fruitful discussion to take place. So now, Sharon, I'm wondering about those questions. I see we have just a couple minutes left. I'm happy to answer.
We do have a couple questions. We have a couple comments too. One from Sarah says, thank you for breaking the rule about slides. I don't have to feel guilty anymore.
You bet.
And Marcia had to leave but said, thank you for the information. Nicely done. Linda wanted to share one rule that I'll say amen to. Never read the text on your slide to your audience. And Jason had a question. How do you manage the process and development of the presentation if the presenter is last minute, controlling, and has problems engaging with their audience?
Can you read that last portion of it again? I think I might have missed it.
Okay, sure. How do you manage the process and development of the presentation if the presenter is last minute, controlling, and has problems engaging with their audience?
Okay, so I'm assuming that this question is that the questioner is creating content for somebody else to deliver who is kind of last minute and not very engaging.
I would say that's a grid. They're not giving you anything. This happens to me all the time doing webinars. You know, it's 5 minutes to go in the air and I still don't have final copy.
Yeah, I think that one of the things is making sure that you set expectations early on. Now that's easier said than done when you are working with someone who sits above you, but helping them understand that you can't help them unless they help you. I think that's really critical, and helping them understand that this is a team effort, not just a me and a you thing, but it's an us. Let's do this together. And also, I would say to the questioner is take a look at that default approach and the recommendations that we have in the handout, because if you can identify what the speaker's default is, either a writer or an improviser, I'm guessing in this case probably an improviser, we have some recommendations there to help keep them on track and get them prepared in a way that will work for them, uniquely for them.
That's all we have time for, but I do have a question, which I'll end with. When you and I met the other day to prepare for today, you told a story about Walt Disney and the Seven Dwarfs. I think this audience would benefit from that.
Yeah, so I talk about this a lot. Now, let's assume that Walt Disney was making a pitch to his team for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but let's also assume that PowerPoint existed back when Walt would have been doing this. And let's assume that he had training that said, Walt, you may never have more than 6 bullets per slide. So now what is Walt supposed to do? He has to make the case for Snow White and 7 dwarfs. And yet he can only use 6 points on his slide. What is he going to do? Well, this is the reason that those types of rules just do not make any sense in the business world. Walt needs to either break that rule, or he needs to split the 7 dwarves up onto 2 slides, which doesn't make any sense. So I would say, if I were coaching Walt, I would say, Walt, break that rule, put all 7 dwarves on there. Yes, put their pictures, that's cool. Put their names up there in words, that's cool too, because the bunch of them, the group of them, that's what's important, the 7 of them together.
I think that makes perfect sense.
I want to mention that if you are interested in getting a copy of The Orderly Conversation, you can do that at our website and use the promo code SAWGREG, S-A-W-G-R-E-G, for $5 off.
Oh, that's terrific. I'm sorry I took away the slide presentation before you got a chance to say that.
No worries.
Want to thank you, Greg. I thought this was fabulous. I really have enjoyed working with you, getting ready for today, and you're so engaging and so much fun during a webinar. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
So today's webinar will be hosted for free on both our YouTube channel and our website. You'll be able to link to it from the top page and on our webinar page. And of course, we'll also send you a link, follow-up email with the link. So I also want to share with you that, we have an exciting summer coming up. We will have Rick Altman doing Marvelous Makeovers Presentation Edition, and he's actually going to be making over our housekeeping slides, so we're not so sure about that, but we think it's a great idea. The other thing is we have an exciting lineup coming up in August. We're going to do our first industry trend panel hosted by Rick, myself and Dave. Nolan Hames and a couple others will be joining us. And we think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's the first time we've done something kind of state of the industry, and we think it will be something that you'll find very informative. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and at this time we're going to end the webinar.
Thanks so much.